In Love, Never Say Never novel audiobook. Chapter 2 to Chapter 7. The bedroom door was abruptly pushed open before I could ponder any further. Slightly drenched, Ashton headed straight for the bathroom without sparing me a second glance. Following that was the sound of running water. His return made it rather impossible for me to continue sleeping, so I got up and put on some clothes. I took out a set of his pajamas from the wardrobe and placed it by the bathroom door before going straight to the balcony. As it was the monsoon season, it started to drizzle outside. The sky was dark and the sound of the rain pelting on the bricks could be heard vaguely. Sensing the sound of movement behind me, I turned and saw that Ashton had emerged from the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist. His hair was damp and the droplets of water dripping down his muscular body created an enticing sight. He probably noticed my gaze, so he glanced at me with a slight frown. "Come here," he commanded in a voice void of emotion. I obediently walked over and caught the towel that he had thrown toward me. He then demanded, "Dry my hair." I had long gotten accustomed to his domineering ways. Just as he sat on the edge of the bed, I climbed onto it and kneeled behind him to wipe his hair. "Grandpa's funeral is tomorrow. We should head over to the family home earlier," I reminded him. I wasn't trying to make conversation with him. Rather, I was worried that he would possibly forget about it as his mind was rather occupied with Rebecca. He grunted out a response and said nothing further. Knowing very well that he didn't want to interact with me, I kept mum and focused on drying his hair. After that, I lay on the bed once again, ready to sleep. I realized that I had been feeling rather sleepy lately, and attributed my behavior to my pregnancy. Ashton would usually head to his study after he showered and would stay there until midnight. Given that was the norm, I was befuddled when he got under the sheets after he put on his pajamas. With reasonable effort, I managed to withhold my questions even though I was utterly confounded. In spite of that, his arms suddenly wrapped around my waist as he pulled me in toward him. Then, a feather-light kiss brushed across my lips. I raised my eyes to gaze at him in perplexity. "Ashton, I am unwilling," he questioned. His obsidian eyes flashed, a hint of wild desire swirling within them. I lowered my gaze. Indeed, I was unwilling, but it wasn't for me to decide. "Can you be gentler? The fetus was only 6 weeks old and the risk of a miscarriage was high." His brows furrowed, and without a word he rolled over and started ravaging me roughly. My body curled from the pain and I could only do so much to protect the child from harm's way. The rain started to pour heavily in tandem with his rough movements. Lightning flashed across the sky and thunder boomed right after that, causing the room to be illuminated every time that happened. After a long while, he got up and went into the bathroom. Drenched in a cold sweat from the pain, I had the urge to get up to take some painkillers. Nevertheless, I dismissed the idea as soon as I thought of the child. All of a sudden, the phone on the bedside table rang. It was Ashton's phone. I glanced at the clock on the wall and saw that it was already 11 o'clock. Rebecca was the only one who would call him at such an hour. The sound of running water in the bathroom stopped. Ashton stepped out once again, wrapped in his towel. Wiping his hands dry, he hurriedly answered the call. Unable to hear the words that were being uttered on the other end of the line, I could only observe Ashton's brows furrowing slightly as he exclaimed, "Rebecca, stop fooling around." With that, he ended the call, got changed, and prepared to leave. In the past, I would have turned a blind eye to it, but this time I abruptly grabbed Ashton's arm and pleaded softly, "Can you stay tonight?" He frowned as a hint of displeasure made its way to his handsome face. "Did I pleasure you so much that you were starting to act out?" His words oozed with sarcasm. I was taken aback for a moment before I began to think that his words were absurd. Tilting my head to gaze at him, I explained, "It's Grandpa's funeral tomorrow. Although you can't bear to let her go, shouldn't you practice a little restraint?" Are you threatening me? He narrowed his eyes at me. He gripped my chin in a trice and spat out in a low and dangerous voice. You seem to have grown a spine, Scarlett Stovall. I knew very well that getting him to stay was impossible. But I still wanted to try my luck. Leveling my gaze with his, I announced, I agree to a divorce. But I have my conditions. Stay here tonight and accompany me throughout Grandpa's funeral. I'll sign the divorce papers as soon as it ends. His gaze narrowed. His dark orbs brimmed with ridicule and his mouth twitched slightly. Please me. He released my chin and leaned forward to whisper against my ear. All talk and no action will get you nowhere, Scarlett. His voice was icy with a hint of provocation. I knew what he meant. So I snaked my arms around his waist as I leaned my face close to his. I probably looked comical due to the height difference between us. I didn't know how to feel about it. I had used such a despicable method to force the person I liked to stay with me. Pathetic. Perhaps. Following my instincts, I was about to slide my hand downwards when I was suddenly grabbed by him. I snapped my head up and was met with his dark and impenetrable eyes. That's enough. His flat voice stunned me for a moment as I tried but failed to comprehend his words. He then took his grey pajamas from the bed and put them on in a few elegant motions. I was dumbfounded for a while before I eventually recovered from my shock. Is he staying? To my utter misfortune, before I could even feel happy about my accomplishment, a woman's voice sounded outside the window amidst the pitter-patter of the rain. Ashton. While I was still in shock, Ashton had already reacted. He walked toward the balcony in large strides and looked out. Then, with a gloomy expression, he picked up his coat and left the bedroom. Rebecca was standing in the rain below the balcony. The cold droplets had already drenched her thin dress completely by then. The beautiful woman was already frail, and she looked increasingly pitiful as she persevered in the rain. Draping the coat that he had brought with him over her shoulders, Ashton was about to chide Rebecca. In spite of that, she hugged him tightly and sobbed in his arms. As the scene unfolded, a sudden realization dawned upon me. I finally understood why my 2-year marriage with Ashton couldn't compare to a single phone call from Rebecca. Ashton led Rebecca into the villa with his arm around her. I stood at the top of the stairs when he brought her up, blocking their way just as I scanned their soaked clothes. Get out of the way, Ashton snapped in disgust. Was I sad? I didn't know, either. But my eyes hurt more than my heart did. Having witnessed the person they loved treating another woman as a precious gem, all while trampling all over me. Ashton, back when we'd gotten married, you promised Grandpa that you would never allow her to set foot in this house as long as I am here. This was where Ashton and I lived together. On more nights than I could count, I had let Rebecca have him. As if that weren't enough, he was allowing her taint the only place I could call mine. Ha! Ashton sneered in return. Shoving me aside, he retorted coldly. You think too highly of yourself, Scarlett. His mockery toward me knew no bounds. In the end, I could only watch as he brought Rebecca into the guest room like the bystander I was. Tonight was destined to be a restless night. Rebecca was exposed to the heavy downpour outside. Her body was already weak to begin with, so she developed a high fever from standing in the rain. Ashton cared for her like a precious gem, assisting her in changing into a clean set of clothes while using a towel to bring down her temperature. Perhaps the sight of me standing there was an eyesore to him, so he directed his cold gaze at me and ordered, "Go back to the Fullers' family home now. Rebecca won't be able to go anywhere tonight in her current state. He wants me to go at this hour. Ha ha. I guess I really am an eyesore." After staring at Ashton for a long time, I couldn't find the words to remind him that the family home was miles away from here. It would be dangerous for a woman to go out alone this late at night. However, such things didn't concern him. He only cared about making sure that Rebecca's rest wasn't too affected by my presence. I forced myself to breathe through the bitter pain in my chest before declaring placidly, I'll return to the bedroom. It's not appropriate to be heading to the family home now. I would not allow him to step all over me even though I knew he didn't cherish me one bit. Upon leaving the guest room, I met Jared Crest along the corridor as he hurried over. Noticing that he was still clad in his black pajamas, I deduced that he must have rushed over to the villa. He hadn't even changed his shoes and his pajamas were almost completely soaked through. The corridor wasn't exactly wide, so we came face to face with one another. Stunned for a while, he then straightened his clothes and explained, Miss Stovall, I am here to treat Rebecca. Jared was Ashton's best friend. They say that you only need to look at the attitude of a man's best friend to truly know whether he holds affection toward you. Attitude aside, the way that he addressed me was enough to prove that I would only ever be Miss Stovall. What a polite and distant form of address. I learned not to dwell too much on the details as they would only bring me heartache. Forcing a smile onto my lips, I gave way to him as I replied, go ahead. Now and again, I truly admired Rebecca. She merely needed to shed a few tears to receive the warmth that would never be bestowed upon me even after half a lifetime of hard work. Back in the bedroom, I found a suit that Ashton had never worn before. Eventually, I brought it with me as I walked down toward the living room. Jared made quick work of treating Rebecca. After measuring her temperature and prescribing her the relevant medications, he was prepared to leave. When he came downstairs and saw me standing in the living room, he offered me a civil smile. It's getting late now. Aren't you going to sleep yet, Miss Stovall? I'll sleep soon. I passed him the clothes in my hand as I professed. Your clothes are wet and it's still raining outside. You should change into this before you leave or you'll catch a cold. He was probably surprised by my gesture because he blinked at me without saying anything for a while. Then, his handsome face stretched into a grin. It's alright. I am as fit as a bull. So I'll be completely fine. I stuffed the clothes into his hands and insisted. Ashton has never worn this before. Even the tags are still there. You two are almost the same size, just take it. With that, I climbed the stairs and returned to the bedroom. My actions weren't out of pure kindness by any means. Back when my grandmother was hospitalized, Jared was her attending surgeon. He was an internationally renowned doctor. If it weren't for the Fullers, he would never have agreed to perform surgery on my grandmother. The clothes were my way of repaying him. The next day, after a whole night of heavy rain, the morning air was filled with a musky and fresh scent. I was used to waking up early. After washing up, I went downstairs only to see Ashton and Rebecca in the kitchen. Ashton had a black apron tied around his hips as he was frying eggs by the stove. Gone was his harsh and wintry vibe. Now, he seemed as though he was surrounded by a halo of joy. Rebecca's bright eyes followed his movements. Her delicate and pretty face was slightly flushed, likely due to the fact that her fever had only just subsided. She actually appeared both cute and charming. Ash, I want my fried eggs to be slightly burnt. As she spoke, her hand lifted to feed Ashton a strawberry before she continued. But not too burnt, or it'll taste bitter. Ashton munched on the strawberry as he turned his gaze toward her. Although he had merely kept silent, his eyes were enough to convey the extent of his indulgence toward her. They were both blessed with refined features and they made such a fine couple. Their gestures were warm and sweet, there was indeed romance in the air. They look really good together. Don't you think so? A voice resounded from behind, startling me. I looked over my shoulder and found Jared standing there. I forgot that it had rained heavily last night. And given Rebecca was down with a high fever, of course Ashton did not let Jared leave. Good morning. I smiled when my gaze lowered and realized that he was wearing the clothes I had given him the previous night. Observing my gaze, Jared raised his brows with a smile. These clothes fit me quite well. Thank you. I shook my head. Don't mention it. I had bought it for Ashton, but he never once bothered to try it. Hearing our voices, Rebecca turned toward us and called out, Scarlett, Jared, you both awake. Ashton has fried some eggs for breakfast. Come on over and have some. She spoke as though she was the lady of the household. Shooting her a bland smile, I hurriedly refused. It's fine. I bought some bread and milk yesterday. The milk is still in the fridge. You've only just recovered. So you should drink more. I lived here for 2 years. The title deed had both my name and Ashton's listed on it. Although I was often compliant, it was only natural that I could not bear seeing someone else barge into my home and acting as if they owned the place. Rebecca was stunned upon hearing my words. Her eyes darkened a little and she looked back at Ashton, tugging on his sleeve before telling him softly, Ash, I was out of line last night. I see that I have disturbed both you and Scarlett. Can you ask her to stay to have breakfast with us? Just take it as an apology from me. Please? Indeed. Some people don't need to work to earn an ounce of affection. All they need to do is bat their lashes and act vulnerable. And they'll be able to get away with even murder. Ashton had initially paid me no heed. But when Rebecca spoke up, he glanced at me and stated, Let us eat together. His tone was cold and commanding. Did it hurt? I was already numb to the pain. I flashed a smile and nodded. Thank you. I could never bear to refuse Ashton, because he was someone whom I had fallen in love with at first sight. Getting over him would be undoubtedly difficult. I suppose that it was my lucky day since this was the first time that I got to taste the food made by Ashton. Fried eggs and bacon were nothing special, but they still left a deep impression on me. All along, I had thought that a man like Ashton Fuller was above everyone else. I thought he would never stoop so low as to cook with his own 2 hands. Scarlett, try the fried eggs that Ash has made. They're excellent. When we were together, he always made this for me, Rebecca urged while placing an egg on my plate. Then, with a saccharine smile on her face, she gave one to Ashton as well. Ash, you promised to accompany me to see the flowers today. You can't break your promise. Okay. Ashton responded while eating his breakfast. His movements as refined as that of a prince. He was never one to speak unnecessarily, but whenever it came to Rebecca, he would always be sure to respond to all of her questions and requests. Jared seemed to be accustomed to this already as he ate his breakfast in a sophisticated manner. He was quietly watching our interactions as if he was an outsider. I lowered my gaze as my brows furrowed into a frown. Grandpa's funeral is today. If Ashton leaves with Rebecca, what's going to happen to our plan of going to the Fuller's family home? No one could fully enjoy their breakfast today. After having a few bites, Ashton headed upstairs to change his clothes. I set my cutlery down and followed after him. In the bedroom, Ashton knew that I had entered after him, so he asked in an indifferent voice, Do you need something? With that, he casually removed his clothes, putting his sturdy figure on display. I instinctively turned around so that my back would face him. Grandpa's funeral is today. I heard some shuffling noises behind me as well as the sound of his zipper being zipped. His monotonous voice soon followed. You can go over yourself. The frown on my face deepened. He is your grandfather, Ashton. Ashton was the eldest grandson of the Fullers. If he were absent from the funeral, what would the rest of his family think? I've already told Joseph Campbell to handle the funeral. You can communicate with him on the details. He spoke without emotion as if he were explaining a matter that was irrelevant to him. When he walked toward his study, a pang of sadness engulfed me. I was quick to raise my voice. Ashton, is everyone other than Rebecca dispensable to you? Does your family mean nothing to you? He paused in his stride before turning to look at me with narrowed eyes, emanating a chilly vibe. He told me, You're not in a position to lecture me on my family matters. After a brief pause, He curled his lips and spat disdainfully. "You're not worthy." His words hit me like a bucket of cold water, chilling me to the bone. As I listened to his gradually retreating steps, a mirthless chuckle escaped my lips. I am unworthy. Ha! 2 long years had passed. Yet, my efforts in getting him to warm up to me were futile. I thought you were thick-skinned, but I never expected you to poke your nose into other people's businesses as well. A mocking voice reached my ears. I turned toward the voice and saw Rebecca leaning against the door frame with her arms crossed in front of her chest. Gone was her cute and innocent facade. Instead, a frosty expression had taken residence on her face. "Miss Larson, I am surprised at how fast you've switched personalities." Casting her a cursory glance, I picked up my bag and prepared to make my journey to the Fullers' home. Since Ashton was unwilling to go, it was my job to go in his stead. As soon as I reached the door, Rebecca stepped forward to block my way. Seeing that Ashton was absent, she could finally take a breather from pretending to be a harmless little bunny. She questioned me sharply. "When are you going to sign the divorce papers?" I was stunned for a second. Nevertheless, I released a chuckle as I looked at her. "Are you playing the homewrecker by forcing me to divorce him?" "You're the homewrecker." Calling her that seemed to have hit a nerve because her face darkened as she snarled. "If it weren't for you, the lady of this house would have been me by now. Since George has died, there is no one to protect you. No one who will ensure that you can continue living here. If I were you, I'd sign the divorce papers. Take the money that Ashton has offered, and get as far away from here as possible." "Well, it's a pity that you're not me, Miss Larson," I retorted coldly as I ignored her jabs and skirted around her to go downstairs. Other than Ashton, no one in the world could say anything to hurt me. Being a person who had always basked in the limelight, Rebecca felt dissatisfied that I was ignoring her. She suddenly gave a hard grip on my arm. "How shameless can you get, Scarlett? Ash doesn't even like you. So what's the use of clinging on to him?" Glancing back at her, I had the urge to laugh, but my next words were uttered calmly. "Since you're aware of his stance toward me, what's there to be nervous about?" "You." She flushed a bright red, unable to respond. I leaned closer to her with a faint sneer on my lips and lowered my voice into a whisper. "As for why I am clinging on to him," I paused as I evened out my tone. "He has got some mad skills. So you tell me, what's the use of it?" "You're so shameless." Rebecca's eyes reddened with anger. Without thinking, she raised her hands and intended to push me. The stairs were behind me, so out of instinct, I twisted sideways to avoid getting pushed by her. Nonetheless, I never expected her to lose her own footing. She fell right down the stairs. Ahhhhh. Her ear-splitting scream resounded throughout the living room, and I stood rooted to the ground for a while, unable to react. To my misfortune, I was shoved aside just as I sensed a frosty front darting my way. Then, Ashton's figure shot down the stairs as he went to check on Rebecca, who was already lying at the bottom of the stairs. Rebecca was curled into a ball on the floor, holding her abdomen with an agonized look on her ashen face. She spoke in a feeble voice. My child. My child." There was blood pooling beneath her body, staining a large area of the carpet red. Every fiber in my body froze. She's pregnant with Ashton's child. Ash. The child. The child. Rebecca tugged at Ashton's sleeve as she repeated the words like a broken record. Beads of sweat covered Ashton's forehead. His icy expression sank with dread. "Don't be afraid. The child will be fine." He comforted Rebecca and scooped her into his arms before he strode toward the door. After taking a few steps forward, Ashton stopped abruptly. His glowering eyes were as dark as an abyss, and the anger in his voice was palpable. "I bet that you're happy, Scarlett." His simple words were full of hatred and fury. I was bereft of speech. I did not know how to react. Aren't you going after them to explain? A deep voice came from behind, jolting me into action. I turned and was stunned to see Jared there all of a sudden. Suppressing the panic that was rising in my heart, I calmly asked, "Explain what?" He raised his brows. "Aren't you afraid that he would think that you pushed Rebecca?" My eyes dipped down as a hint of bitterness shone through them. "It doesn't matter whether I pushed her. The truth is that Rebecca is hurt and someone has to take the blame for it. It's good that you know." Jared descended the stairs as he left the villa with his medical kit in hand. He was probably heading off to the hospital to see Rebecca. It was an hour's journey from the villa to the Fullers' family home. Throughout the entire hour, I felt like I was in a daze. My mind was flooded with thoughts about the child and Rebecca's belly and the look in Ashton's eyes before he left. I couldn't seem to draw enough air into my lungs. My chest tightened, and just as the car pulled to a stop in front of the Fullers' family home, a wave of nausea washed over me. I rushed out of the car and rested on the flower bed for a long time, unable to throw up. "It seems like being Mistress Fuller has made you fragile. Seeing that you've almost vomited after a short car ride." A sharp and distasteful voice sounded out from the front door of the house. I didn't need to look to know who it was. George had 2 sons. The elder one was Christopher Fuller, who had died in a car accident along with his wife years ago, leaving his only son, Ashton, behind. George's second son was Charlie Fuller. At that moment, the one mocking me outside the family home was Uncle Charlie's wife, Helen Clark. There were many internal feuds within wealthy families, so I had already gotten used to this. I suppressed the discomfort in my stomach as I stared at Helen, greeting her politely. "Aunt Helen." Helen had always disliked me. Perhaps she was jealous that I was favored by George despite coming from a poor background. Or perhaps she was disgruntled because George had valued Ashton so much that he handed the reins of this household to him. Given the context, she could have been venting out her anger on me. She cast an icy glance at me before gazing behind me. Upon noticing there was no one else inside the car, her expression darkened. "What? Ashton, the favorite grandson, didn't even show up for his grandfather's funeral?" There would be many guests here today, so Ashton's absence was indeed unacceptable. I lifted my lips into a smile and gave her a perfunctory reply. "An important issue has arisen, so Ashton might run late." "Ha ha," Helen sneered. "This is the person whom my father-in-law has placed all his hope on. I wonder what he saw in him." The Fullers were an influential family. So many people attended the funeral to pay their respects. Although Helen was repulsed by me, for the sake of appearances, she didn't make things too difficult for me. We entered the family home together. George's casket was in the middle of the hall where some white flowers were arranged on top of it. Many people entered, one after the other, all clad in black mourning attire. George was well known, so those who came to offer their respects were all from outstanding backgrounds. Charlie and Helen greeted them outside, while I greeted them inside the hall. "Miss Stovall." Mistress Erickson strode toward me with a sandalwood box in hand. "Mistress Erickson, what's wrong?" The Fuller family wasn't all that complicated despite being a wealthy family because there weren't many descendants. George had always preferred a life of peace and solace and had only hired Mistress Erickson to take care of him. Mistress Erickson placed the sandalwood box in my hands with a sympathetic expression on her face. "This was left to you by Mr. Fuller before he passed on. Keep it safe." She paused briefly before continuing. "Mr. Fuller was aware that Mr. Ashton would possibly force you into a divorce upon his demise. If you don't want that to happen, give this box to him. Once he sees it, he'll think twice before divorcing you." I dipped my head to look at the square-shaped box in my hand. It was secured with a hidden lock. Glancing at Mistress Erickson, I asked in puzzlement, "Where is the key?" "Mr. Fuller already gave it to Mr. Ashton." Mistress Erickson studied me as she advised. You've lost a lot of weight recently. You should take care of your health. Mr. Fuller has always hoped that you and Mr. Ashton would have a healthy son together so that there would be an heir to the family. Now that Mr. Fuller is gone, don't let the family bloodline end with the two of you. At the mention of a child, I was taken aback for a while. Then, I offered Mistress Erickson a smile, deciding not to comment any further on it. After the prayers, Grandpa's casket would be brought to the cemetery for burial. It was already noon when we arrived, but Ashton still hadn't shown up. Ashton had yet to make an appearance even after the funeral was over. Charlie soon approached me with Helen on his arm as he urged to me, "Letty, your Grandpa George won't be coming back ever again. Go and tell Ashton to stop holding a grudge against his grandfather. The old man doesn't owe him anything." Thanks for listening to the Bravonovel audiobook. Welcome to download the Bravonovel app. Read the novel in love. Never say never online and get the latest updates. Please see the video introduction for the novel details page and app download address.